We begin in Ecuador. The country is headed for general elections on February 7th, 2021. After 4 years of Lenín Moreno's neoliberal government, an economic crisis, corruption scandals, and recently becoming one of the worst hit countries by COVID-19 in the world. To discuss these topics, we have María Cecilia Herrera, a human rights lawyer and pre-candidate for the National Assembly. Hello, María Cecilia. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, Carla. Thank you for the invitation. It is a great honor for me.
So, María Cecilia, keeping in mind everything that's going on at the moment in Ecuador, how does this Unity for Hope alliance of these progressive parties in Ecuador intend to win the elections?
Well, UNE stands for Unity for Hope in Spanish, and it's a platform that seeks to join forces with all progressive or left-wing movements and parties in Ecuador in order to defeat the neoliberal forces in the 2021 elections. UNE has presented its binomial, including Andrés Arauz running for president and Rafael Correa for vice president. This decision was based mainly on the need to solve the serious economic problems that the country is going through. They are both economists, and for sure they have the know-how to save the country from the serious economic crisis that this government and the pandemic have left.
And specifically on the part of the candidacy for Rafael Correa, we have seen a rise in the use of lawfare in Latin America, especially against leaders like Correa himself. And he was recently sentenced, and this process, of course, had a lot of irregularities. So what has been the response in Ecuador and around the world that now Correa wants to return to a political office? Can he still run?
Rafael Correa can still be a candidate for any popularly elected position as long as his criminal case is not resolved. Now, while the National Electoral Council accepts candidates' inscriptions through the internet, they have set up an ad hoc procedure in order to bar former President Correa to register as a candidate. They are now forcing candidates to formally accept their nomination in person. And given this new requirement, Correa would not be able to come to the country to register, because if he does, he would be detained, of course. So his participation as a candidate, I think, is still yet to be determined.
So in Ecuador, authorities have announced that they are considering making voting optional, because at the moment in Ecuador it's mandatory to do so. They say that this is because they are afraid of a new COVID-19 outbreak. But it is similar to what authorities for the de facto government in Bolivia are using. They're saying that the elections have to be postponed, and they have done so now for 3 times this year. Can it be possible that the government of Moreno can somehow alter the election dates, can change the actual date of people going to vote?
Well, I think that would be unconstitutional. But I think also that, unfortunately for the authoritarian regimes of the region, the pandemic has given some sort of legitimacy for their strategy to block popular leaders. For example, like you said, in Bolivia, the de facto government is doing everything in its power to extend its illegal takeover. They are not only trying to ban Luis Arce from participating in the elections by all means, but they are now trying to postpone election and extending in power. Let us remember that in Bolivia, there was a manufactured electoral fraud led by Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS. And this coup was definitely organized with the complicity of the United States and the Organization of American States. And the fear is that this scenario happens also in Ecuador. The government is already sending some preliminary messages, like you mentioned, such as the pandemic will make it difficult to hold elections, or there is not enough money to carry out elections due to the pandemic and the economic crisis. And the truth is that the final objective behind these actions is to ban popular leaders such as Rafael Correa from participating in elections in order to benefit the interests of the US and the economic elite of our countries. In the case of Ecuador specifically, I believe that any human rights lawyer, any citizen that embraces democracy should feel deeply concerned by this situation, regardless of whether or not they agree with Correa's party. I think this is no longer a matter of political parties. It is a matter of respect for the rule of law, human rights, and democracy.
So it will be Ecuador's first election during the pandemic. We have seen tens of thousands of deaths due to the COVID-19. And the city of Guayaquil, where you are running for office in the province of Guayas, We saw a complete collapse of the healthcare system. We saw bodies laying on the streets during the worst months of the pandemic. How has the government continued to manage this crisis?
Well, I think there has been a terrible negligence on the part of the government in the management of the health crisis. Let us remember that the Ecuadorian health system has been weakened for the last 3 years. Investment in health decreased by approximately 66 million between 2018 and 2019. That is around 36% less in budget. Also, 2,500 employees in the health sector, public employees, were dismissed last year as well, complying with the provisions of the International Monetary Fund and its well-known austerity policies. And these cuts have been paid, of course, by all Ecuadorians, but especially by all the people who died as a result of a pandemic, those who could not find a bed in a hospital, who could not find a respirator, or who died because the ambulance never reached their homes. And let us also remember that during the worst peak of the pandemic, the government decided to make a payment of 324 million of foreign debt instead of using this money to face the health emergency. The reality is that the debt had been bought through bonds by some Ecuadorian citizens. It has not yet been made public who would be the beneficiaries of those bonds, but a theory that some analysts have is that this payment was made to benefit the Ecuadorian elites who own those bonds and who co-govern with Moreno. All this led, of course, to the crisis that was experienced in the city of Guayaquil and that you mentioned, with a completely collapsed health system, bodies rotting in the streets. And what is more serious, of course, the virus affects everyone equally, but inequalities have deepened. You had to pay around $1,600, $2,000 for an oxygen tank. What does this mean? That our health system is unequal and that individuals do not have a true right to health, but rather you have access to the health that you can buy. And at the same time that the government decided to pay the foreign debt instead of investing in the construction of mobile hospitals or the purchase of medical supplies to attend a wave of patients with respiratory problems, the government announced the construction of mass graves and the creation of a joint task force to bury the bodies of the deceased. Later, the mass graves decision was reversed, but you can definitely conclude that the government's political priority was never to find a way to guarantee the lives of all people, but to prepare for their deaths. And we're seeing it now too. According to international reports, Ecuador's death toll during COVID-19 outbreak is among the worst in the world. Around 30,000 people died. And despite of this, the government has decided to relax the restrictions to benefit the business elites of the country. And the message that Moreno and his authorities are sending is that human lives are not important for this government.
Indeed, and that also ties up to the protests that we saw last year that were massive against Moreno's government and demanding his resignation. Also, he has about 80% of disapproval rating at the moment. Can we expect any more of these protests just months before the election?
Well, as you mentioned, the protests began in October 3rd after President Lenin Moreno signed off on austerity measures that eliminated a 1.3 billion gasoline subsidy. And when demonstrations exploded throughout the country as a result of these anti-popular measures that affected the working class and that were imposed without any process of dialogue with the affected persons, we then witnessed a government that does not hesitate to violate the human rights of its citizens. During the October protests, we saw security forces using excessive force against protesters, journalists, including firing tear gas canisters directly at individuals and at close range, hitting people in the head, damaging eyes. We also witnessed security forces brutally beating and arbitrarily detaining protesters. Actually, the ombudsperson's office reported that more than 1,000 people were detained. Most of them were released by judges at their first hearing on the grounds that their arrests did not meet legal requirements. Police also released tear gas onto the university campuses of 2 universities, which were being used as shelters for women, children, injured protesters. Approximately 10 people died in the context of a protest, according to Human Rights Watch. At least 4 people appear to have been killed directly by security forces. unfortunately, the Interior Ministry and the Prosecutor General's office have failed to investigate these abuses and crimes. And regarding your question, if we can expect more protests, I think the pandemic has been helping the government to kind of contain people to manifest in the streets. I do not see in the immediate future the same kind of protests that we saw last year, unfortunately.
Indeed, and all these, of course, this context will play a major role in the upcoming elections. Thank you very much, Maria Cecilia, for your time.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Telesur also.